Hey, greetings from a semi-productive day in isolation. I've got about half an hour while my baked potato is cooking, so I thought I'd finally record something about maple syruping. Broadly speaking, you have three parts to the process. There's the tapping at the start of the trees, then the collecting of the sap from the trees, and then the boiling of the sap down to make maple syrup. So tapping is done with little metal cylinders which have one pointy end and the other end that looks kind of like a tap. And when you have your sugar orchard, so a lot of maple syrup trees, you go around, not all of them, but maybe half. That would be several hundred trees, maybe 100, 200, 300, and you tap them with one tap per tree. Some commercial operations actually do a lot more taps in one tree, but this damages it, and this is also the reason for not tapping every tree in your orchard, because you want to alternate on different years which trees you tap so that the tree is able to recover. And for a similar reason, while some maple syrup orchards would put maybe 3 or 4 buckets off the same tree, the one where I was, they would only use 1 bucket per tree in order to let the tree recover. So yeah, you drive these in with a hammer, and then off each tap near the tree itself you hang a bucket, and this simply fills up. And then when you are collecting the syrup, you walk around the different trees and you take these buckets and empty them into big tanks, big containers that are up on the hillside. Again, some commercial operations actually have individual tubes running from each tree back to the syruping hut, where there'll be a master tank at the bottom which collects all of the liquid eventually. But the problem with this, or the difficulty, is that you have to maintain all of the different individual pipes. And if there is a problem with one, for example, if a heavy branch falls down onto one length of tubing, then this can bring down that part of the tubing and you're not collecting any more sap, and also it can affect the rest of the network. Or what happens more often, you might get an air bubble trapped in part of the pipe, and this stops the sap from being able to run down, and also again affects the rest of the network, because a bubble quite far down the hill, quite near to the tank in the sugaring hut, would actually stop sap flowing from the network above it as well. And this happens quite often. So as it is, traditionally people would probably go round with a horse and cart and collect all of the buckets and then take them down the hill to the tank. What we did was kind of in between, where we had big tanks up on the hillside, say 35 litres, 150 litres, and we would walk around the trees, take the buckets, empty them into these tanks, and those tanks, maybe about 4 or 5 of them, have individual pipes that go down to the main tank in the hut, which is huge. It maybe 1,000 litres or 500 litres, something like this. I'm not good with volume. So this is where you stop the collecting and you start actually turning the sap into syrup. The big tank has a tap with a valve on it, which hangs out over a couple of boiling pans. These are where your sap flows into, and then it boils off the water, 40 parts of water, in order to turn into maple syrup. So in order to get syrup from sap, you have to boil off about 40 to 60 parts to 1 to get the right concentration of sugar, and then it's considered maple syrup. And it depends what part in the season you are. The boiling usually takes about 5 hours at the start of the season, when the sugar is more dense in the sap, and closer to 8 hours by the end of the season, when the sugar is less dense there. In order to boil it off, you open up the valve in the tap and you let it flow through into the first section of the first boiling pan. Each boiling pan has about 4 sections, and these are strips created by internal division, which are about 20 centimetres wide, and sap flows from one strip to another in a sort of like a marble run almost, because each internal division has a little hole, a circular hole, in one corner at the bottom, and it's always the opposite corner from where the hole is in the previous division. So the sap has to flow the whole length of that division in order to flow into the next one. And like this, when you pour sap in, it starts off in the division closest to the tank, and then eventually it flows all the way through to the part closest to where you have a tap out of the boiling pans, which you can pull your maple syrup out of. The boiling pans are sitting over the top of a furnace. The furnace is at the far end, so over the end where you're under the end where you're extracting maple syrup. And you just heat this up with logs. Underneath, the bit closest to the tank, it actually has bricks, and they're slower to heat up, but they also stay hot for a long time. It gets very hot indeed. In fact, it's so hot that when you open the doors, it's kind of painful to put your face close enough to be able to throw more logs in. So the longer that the maple syrup has been in the pans, the longer it has been boiling off, the closer it is to the far end of the boiling pans, and the less water content it has. So you usually keep the tap from the main tank open permanently, so you have a constant flow of sap in, and you're just trying to boil off enough that the liquid at the end condenses. It makes room always continuously for the liquid coming in from the tank, because the stuff that's already there becomes more dense and therefore takes up less volume. And you try and keep it at a level between 1 inch and 2 inches deep constantly. So you have to make sure that you're boiling it off at the right rate. And when the liquid at the end, so near where you're going to let it out when it's maple syrup, becomes 217 Fahrenheit. I did a calculation for this in Celsius. I think it's about 130 something degrees. Then you start measuring the sugar content with a glicometer, so literally an instrument for measuring sugar content, and it has to be between a certain range. I don't know what that range was. It was marked off with little red markers on the one that we were using, and you dip that into the syrup nearest the end where you draw off, and keep checking whether it's within the maple syrup range or not. And when it is 217 Fahrenheit and it is within this sugar content range, you open up the valve at the far end. Maple syrup sands, which is just like grit, basically. Doesn't taste very nice and kind of unnecessary. So you put it through the strainer, and Bob's your uncle. Then you have to keep measuring the sugar content as you're letting the syrup flow out, because at some point you get the stuff, enough of the syrup has flowed away, which was right at the end, that you start getting things that haven't boiled off enough, and at that point you close the valve. So in your boiling pan divisions, nearest the end you have the stuff that's most like maple syrup, because it's been sitting there for longest. It was the first sap to flow in, and also it's sitting over the hottest part of the boiling pans, which is directly over the furnace. Then in the section that's next furthest away from the drawing off end, so just slightly closer to the tank, you have stuff that's kind of nearly almost maple syrup, and then the next division you have like almost maple syrup, and then the other one you have kind of not really maple syrup, and then it's kind of like, nah, this is just sap. And oh man, one of my favorite discoveries from this was just taking a beaker and scooping out some liquid that was maybe 2/3 of the way to syrup, but it's a little bit less thick and it's piping hot, and just drinking that, I swear it's better than like eating maple syrup itself on anything. Yeah, I'm going back next year, I hope. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it as far as the maple syruping is concerned. You basically just boil off the sap until it becomes more syrup-like, and then you stop boiling it. But there are a whole lot of things that you have to keep an eye on, like what depth the sap is in the boiling pans, and also that it's not bubbling over, in which case you need to break the surface tension by adding a drop of oil. They used to use bacon fat apparently, but this turns something that would otherwise be vegan into something that's very definitely not vegan. So kind of unnecessary. And other than that, yeah, it takes a lot of time and it's a lot of heavy physical work, but personally I'm a glutton for punishment, so that was kind of fun. Yeah, in that case, have a good afternoon and peace out.